That, and we are live here. Hello, Dr. Reem. Let me go over. I've
Hello.
just going to do one thing over here where press go live on that, which is not reacting. So there you go. I can never get that to work, but never mind. Something went wrong. Yes, of course it did. So coming back to you, how are you? Welcome to your first Instagram live with
Thank
me.
you.
You are Dr. Reem Al-Shaikh. You are a GP in the NHS, and you also have a clinic, a private clinic of your own, which is the Women's Wellness Clinic in Cambridge. You are a BMS accredited specialist, but tonight we're talking about bones on the edge of. I know people don't think enough about bones, and as I was saying to you earlier, even I have discovered things about bones that I didn't know in the last few days, because when I went to university and did anatomy and physiology 40 or so years ago, bones were basically for protecting your internal organs, holding you up, moving you around, and blood cell production. But they are now so much more. What do we know about bones now?
Um, Hello. I lovely Instagram glitch there. I lost what you just said, Fiona, but I'm gonna go with I think you're probably telling everyone that they don't know enough about what our bones do.
Yeah, what do they do? I was just saying that before we thought they were skeletal, move us around, protect internal organs, blood cells, but we now discover that they do so much more. What do they do?
Absolutely. So I think so hello, I'm Dr. Reem Al-Shaikh. So I'm a GP. I'm not a metabolic bone specialist, but I'm very enthusiastic about bones. And I manage bones a lot in my day-to-day work. So I think everyone, like you said, thinks that your bones are there, they grow when you're a kid, they get big, and then they're there forever. And that's wrong. They are a really dynamic thing. They are a live tissue. They're constantly changing and remodeling. Our bones don't just hold us up and perform a bit of scaffolding, but they basically are part of our mineral storage. They're part of our hormone balance. They're part of our balance of calcium and vitamin D and phosphorus. And these are all minerals in our bloodstream that are really, really important to maintain good health. Our bones are what I would describe as very metabolic. They've got functions that are wide and varied beyond what we all know. Before we think about bones, I want to just kind of define sort of the two main things that we're going to think about with our bones. There's a type of cell called osteoblasts. This is really simplistic. And what they are is they're building block cells. They build bone, they make bone. And then we've got osteoclasts, which are the cells that break down bone and remodel. And these two guys, they need to work in harmony with each other all the time. And then we have a few osteocytes, and they're kind of like, they're the overseers. They're making sure the matrix is good. They're the old hands. They've got the experience of how these guys need to play nicely. They're like the head teacher in a school. And so we need to understand that these cells exist and they're really important. Now, the osteoblasts, they do something kind of cool. They produce hormones. And one of the most important hormones we need to learn about is something called osteocalcin. And osteocalcin is a hormone that's produced by these bone building cells. And that hormone can have an effect on multiple parts of our body. So, one of the main areas it can have an effect on is an organ called our pancreas. And our pancreas is where insulin is made, and it can actually stimulate the pancreas to make the insulin hormone. And now that's really important because insulin is part of our sugar metabolism, our glucose balance. It's really important it works well and that we're sensitive to it. And what osteocalcin can also do is make our muscles and other fat cells in our body more sensitive to insulin. And that means it's quite helpful at basically balancing. And when we're eating our sugars and when we're doing our exercise, it helps restore balance and it prevents insulin sensitivity, which is a really big problem. Insulin sensitivity is we live in a world of high stress. We have lots of insulin, and then we eat lots of sugar and inflammatory foods. We get even more insulin. And the way you have to understand insulin sensitivity and why it's so important is imagine it was raining every single day. Imagine every day it just rained. Eventually, you'd
I don't
stop
have to
carrying your
imagine that
umbrella.
we're living in England.
Well, I know, but eventually you'd stop wearing your wellies, you'd stop carrying your umbrella, and you just say, whatever, I'm going to get wet. And so what happens when we've got too much insulin is your body just goes, let's just ignore it. And then suddenly we're starting to get problems, metabolic problems, type 2 diabetes, visceral fat, which is not good. It's the nasty fat that encases organs and can cause problems like fatty liver disease, and all these problems start to happen. So going back to the bones, if we have a hormone that's basically making our cells, our muscles more sensitive to insulin and improves the way we manage insulin, we're starting to see how it has quite a big effect on preventing some of these problems. And
Which
osteocalcin,
to a very important question then. If our bones are starting to deteriorate, do we know whether or not there's any correlation between metabolic disease and osteoporosis?
that's
Or is
really
that
interesting. So that's a really interesting question. So you could theorize that if you have poor bones, meaning low bone mineral density, you don't have all these good cells making bones, making all these nice things all the time, regulating our metabolism, then you can assume you'll see more type 2 diabetes, more metabolic problems. And it's interesting that type 2 diabetes, as an example, people with that or on the drugs associated with that are carrying a higher risk of osteoporosis. So we're
mm,
starting to kind of put two and two together. Much of the nitty gritty detail of our bones is still not researched enough. So, can I say that if you have very low bone mineral density, you're definitely going to get type 2 diabetes? No, I can't, because there's so many other factors that would influence whether that happens to you. But you can start to understand how it becomes a bit more likely.
yeah.
And another big hero hormone that, again, I just wanted to mention today was this osteocalcin, this kind of great hormone that's produced by our bone building cells. It kind of has an effect on our fat cells, our adipose tissue. So adipose is just the doctor way of saying fat cells.
Oh, have I lost you? Have I lost?
Stimulate another hormone called adiponectin. Did I lose you there? So
Yeah.
this osteocalcin can affect, yeah, it could affect our fat cells, and those fat cells basically produce a new hormone called adiponectin, and that hormone can reduce triglycerides. It's anti-inflammatory. It can also improve our sensitivity to insulin, and that hormone also improves the way we use our fat stores and the way we use energy, the way our muscles work. So again, you're starting to see how if you've got really strong bones, without even realizing it, you're actually going to have really healthy bodily functions, and you may even burn fat better. And so
Wow.
it's just a kind of a wild idea that I want people to start really thinking about, that actually building bone strength could do more than just make a scan that looks at how thick your bones are a bit better. Like, that's not what this is about only.
And I guess the important thing about that is then that, okay, so you mentioned before that bones are constantly modeling, remodeling, taking bits apart and pulling them back out again. And this goes on during life, but it changes a little bit around the time when we start to see our estrogen levels declining.
Yes.
So what happens when we sort of hit perimenopause, menopause?
So the big headline that we've seen in the news recently is that 50% of women over 50 are likely to break a bone, meaning they're going to have osteoporosis. And that's a really big problem. And we don't want that. And osteoporosis is a silent disease. You don't know you've got it until something goes snap. And then you really know about it. So estrogen, estradiol, which comes from our ovaries, as it starts to drop, what's happening is that hormone has an effect on the cells that build bone and the cells that break down bone. So what it's doing, it's kind of twofold. It's basically reducing the ability of your cells to build new bone. And it's also kind of, to some extent, allowing the bones that remodel, there's the cells that remodel, it's allowing them to do a bit too much of a good job. So they start to break your bone down a bit too fast. So we know that the estrogen hormone in women is really important. And we know that because women are more likely to get osteoporosis than men. Women are far more at risk when they go through their menopause, or if they go through an earlier menopause under the age of 45, or a premature menopause under the age of 40. So we know that women are far more susceptible, and this is largely due to the estrogen loss. But there are so many other factors that we also have to bear in mind when it comes to osteoporosis. So us losing estrogen is bad. It's bad for our bones. Us losing estrogen, though, and smoking, drinking more than the recommended amount of alcohol, not doing enough exercise, that's weight bearing and high resistance, potentially many other things that we could list and we might talk about, can all have an effect on the bones. And so we need to know that we're already at a disadvantage just by being a woman, which is not great, really upsetting and annoying. So we have to work even harder than men to keep our bones healthy, because we're working against the constant tide that our natural estrogen level is dropping. To be honest, the drop starts in our 30s and it starts to just continue to decline. And around 50, we're starting to really feel that loss. And that's our real kind of alarm moment of, what are my bones like? Have I done enough up until this point to keep them as strong as possible? And that's the bit that we really want to get across to women. Don't wait till you're 50 till you break your bone. We don't want that. I don't want you thinking about your bones when you're 60, 65. I want you preparing for the fact that you need to be prepared.
Preparing for the fact that you need to be
Does that make sense?
very, very true. Before we get to that, so basically, you mentioned that that okay, 100% of us go through menopause, but only 50% or so of us, or around that area, are at a greater risk. And you mentioned some of the things then that we can that are
Yeah.
bad for bones. So let's just run through them again, so people are very, very clear. Smoking. Why? How does smoking affect your bones? Because I don't think that people would ever actually even think the relationship between having a cigarette.
Smoking. Okay, so I'm not the biggest fan of smoking, but I want to say I understand why some people smoke. Okay, smoking has to do some good, or you wouldn't do it. But if I could encourage you to put the cigarette down, ladies, I really want to encourage you, because smoking does a couple of bad things. So first of all, in menopause, it basically increases your likelihood of an early menopause. It also exacerbates some of the symptoms. You're more likely to have worsening hot flushes. You're more likely to have brain fog and other problems. Within smoking, there's multiple chemicals, and what we know that happens with smoking is it can affect the cells that effectively are building and breaking down bone. So the smoking itself has an effect on your bone remodeling, and it basically messes it up. So what's happening is you're not building as much bone as you should, whilst the cells that are remodeling are continuing to work. So they're just breaking everything down. Your bones are getting thinner. And in the background, you're going to bring your menopause on earlier. So you're going to lose your estrogen earlier than you should be. So remember, the estradiol, your estrogen is having an effect on your bones. So now you've got two problems. You're smoking, it's in itself had an effect on your bones. It's brought your menopause earlier, which now has an effect on your bones, and the next and the next and the next. So, it ultimately isn't going to be helpful. And what's worse is if you break a bone and continue to smoke, it slows down bone healing. And
Mm,
it's just harder for you to heal and come back from a broken bone. And ultimately, smoking is all around not going to be healthy for you, and good for multiple different parts of your system. But it does have a direct effect. But in twofold, it affects the way the bones work, the way it's being remodeled, and it affects your actual hormonal levels. It's making your basically just speeding up menopause, which is not what you want to be doing.
not really. Then if you add in, being an ex-smoker myself, then if you add in a nice glass of wine, um, so
And I'm
how does
all
the wine
right
affect?
with a nice glass of wine. I'm a big fan of following, the Mediterranean garden diet. Think about what you might be able to grow and make and ferment. And most people in a Mediterranean setting of perfectness could make some wine. But you've got to think about how much wine would you harvest and make, and how much would you honestly drink. And when you're starting to get through bottles and bottles of wine, and for some women that could be every night, then you're drinking in excess. And it's really tricky, okay? Because it's really easy. Modern life is stressful. It's easy to have a drink. Just like smoking, the alcohol does something useful, but it can in itself be quite disruptive. And alcohol, just like smoking, can disrupt that harmony between building bone and remodeling bone. Remember, bone is turning over all the time. And that bone turnover does decline with age, because, like anything, they just get tired and they eventually just go, oh, I don't want to keep making bone and remodeling bone. And we're doing it for like 50 years. This is really tiring. So they just start to not work as well in harmony. So anything we do to disrupt that further is not going to work in our favor. So ultimately, the alcohol recommendations are don't exceed 14 units a week if you're a woman. But the reality is, no one thinks in units. You're thinking, how stressed am I today? How much fun am I having? This is a nice bottle of what might be wine, whatever it might be. So I think my stance is be sensible in moderation. I would never tell someone you've got to quit drinking if drinking is something that you enjoy. We all have a sense of what a really dangerous levels are. But for most women, they do drink in excess and they just don't know it. They don't know it because it's become part of the ritual, part of the routine, and they don't feel drunk. They function well. So that is always a challenge. Sometimes I'm not a big fan of, like, I'm a bit chaotic in life sometimes, but sometimes tracking is helpful. And you can get some free apps that just track not only your macros, but your alcohol. Sometimes just spending a week writing it down makes you go, ah, didn't quite realize. So that
I
would
think
be my tip.
the number of empty bottles in the recycling bin is a pretty good.
Things like that.
I,
What
I
my
took out
lady,
the bag last week and oh, you've disappeared. Are you there? Oh,
sorry
yeah.
about that.
That's right. I took out the bag last week after a number of days and a few guests and things like that. And I thought, oh my God, whoever picks this bag up is going to think we've got some real problems. I hope there are no envelopes in there with our address on
Or
them.
maybe they saw you at a party, but effectively, I think that the reality is there isn't. I haven't got any really in-depth like specifics around alcohol, but
Yep. Come back to me. Come back to me. I've lost you. Not a great connection on your end. Are you there? Oh, hang on. You're there
I think I
again.
vanished, but I'm back.
Yep, you're back. Yep. Yes, where were we? All right, so basically, how does the alcohol affect the bone? Did you tell me that? I can't remember.
So again, it's just disrupting the mechanism between bone building and bone resorption. The cells that are breaking it down are going to be doing that at a faster rate than you're making bone, and the alcohol is disrupting that process. So all in all, it's not helpful to drink in excess. The one glass of wine, I'm all right with, but in excess is when you start to run into trouble.
Yeah. All right, so we know what's bad then, basically. And a sedentary lifestyle, obviously, as well. But what helps? I know everybody's going to say, so
All right.
I really
So
wanted
that's
tonight wasn't just about, resistance exercise and things like that. And I think we've shown that it's not all about just resistance exercise and things that they've already heard, but we have to go over those. So what does help?
all right. So before I go on to what helps, I'm going to just throw in one more thing that's a bit of a challenge, because some women are naturally very slim or have tried really hard to be very, very slim and have a very low, what we call body mass index, less than 18 and a bit. So being very thin in our menopausal years is not great for bone mineral density because you're not carrying enough load. You're not putting any load on your spine to encourage more turnover of bone. So interestingly, this is the one time where I'm going to say being very obese is pretty helpful for this one thing, which is you're less likely to get osteoporosis if you carry a lot of weight because you're carrying a lot of heaviness all the time, which is actually quite helpful for your bones. And we do live in a generation of being a bit obsessed with skinniness. And I always tell my ladies at work, a lot of my NHS patients know this, I say it every day, is get strong, don't get skinny. So it's really important. The weight bearing resistance training, I can't express it enough. It's part of the puzzle. And if you were clicking all the pieces together, wanting to understand what can I do to help my bones, that is a big piece. There's loads of information. There's lots of people in lycra or not lycra. There are doctors, there are general public members telling us how to lift heavy, but I really mean lift heavy. So I
Yep.
can't tell you how many times I get a woman in my practice going, oh, I go to the gym. I think I'm all right there. Go tell me about it. How do you feel at the end of that session? Do you feel like really tired? Do you feel really wiped out? Or do you just feel like you want to go and have a coffee now with your friend? And if you don't feel pretty tired and wiped out, you're not lifting heavy enough. So get advice around what that means if you're interested. With regard,
This is a little. I do go to the gym, and I am lazy. And so the other day, actually, I thought, you know what, I am not lifting because when years ago it was always when most people now you do 3 repetitions of 10 of everything, but these days they say no, it's 4. You do 4. You lift something 4 times and do that 3 times, not 10 times. And at the end of it, you should be going like this. So you should really be struggling to sort of get that weight up. So yesterday I actually sat down in there and I thought, you know what, I'm not really struggling to do this. And so I got myself to the point where I was actually starting to struggle. And I added 20 kilos to virtually every exercise I did. So there
really
you,
impressive. So
yeah.
you can do it and it's be safe, don't injure yourself, but always push yourself. And sometimes classes are helpful because it makes you push more and having an accountability partner. And my last kind of point on weight is I am a big fan of the weighted vest. They're pretty cheap. You can buy them on Amazon. I mean, I do look mental, and everybody who knows me in my NHS practice knows that I walk around the building wearing it. Okay, even my patients. Always have one on the back of my door because there's never a wrong or right time to do a little bit of weight bearing. You basically look like Lara Croft if you walk around your village. I often tell women, look, are you going out for a walk? Are you walking your dog? Are you walking your children? Are you having to just walk somewhere? Put this on. No one's going to notice. I promise you that. And just the 5 kilos is all I've got here. And it just adds that load on my spine. And that has got evidence with regards to building bone density if you're using it. And you're not going to hurt your back. So that's the other bit. Women always get really worried about carrying any extra weight. This is distributed weight. It's not the same as using a backpack. A backpack will pull you back. It's not great for your back unless you've got a really strong core and a really strong set of glutes. But this is really helpful. So big fan of this. And then let's talk about the medicine. So, ultimately, if you actually have osteopenia, which is diagnosed doing a scan. So DEXA scans are bone density scans. They're dual x-rays. They're very low radiation. They're not like even a normal chest x-ray. Like the person doing it can stand next to you on the bed. You lie down, you're in there for about 20 minutes. It's not awful to have one done. And that radiation is being absorbed by your bones, and that's going to tell us basically what your bone density is. It doesn't really tell us about the matrix, about what's going on inside the bone, but it tells us about the thickness of the bones. How likely is it that that bone could break with a small hit or a knock? And so osteopenia means your bones are not normal. They're not osteoporotic, which is an actual disease, but they're on their way. And that's a place where you need to start going, okay, well, if I know that, that's where the good lifestyle, the considering the weight bearing, the really laying down your good habit foundations comes in. Because if you're osteopenic, you can prevent osteoporosis a lot of the time. If you're osteoporotic, then we're talking about treatment. Because no amount, as far as we know, of weight bearing exercise and load and resistance training is ultimately going to 100% reverse osteoporosis.
But
So it's
can you see some
likely,
improvement at least with can you see?
absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. So you will definitely get some improvement. And it's all about percentage incremental improvements. So then we're thinking about, well, what are my options if my bones are actually diagnosed as osteoporotic? There is drug therapy, and there's multiple different types of drug therapy. The drug therapy can include hormone replacement therapy as well. The drug therapy broken down are a mix of oral medications, injectable medications, medications that are infused into your veins once a year. And there are two large groups of treatment drugs. So there are the drugs that basically reduce the activity of the cells that remodel and break down bone. So it makes sense. If those cells aren't doing so much breaking down, then you're going to have more building, which is good. And they are the most commonly used groups of drugs in the UK. And for different reasons, there's good and bad compliance. So some of
This is
them women just,
bisphosphonates for those.
that's right. So
Yeah.
the bisphosphonates are a really common group of drugs. So if ever you've had a conversation with a GP in the UK about osteoporosis, they'll probably mention that drug. The commonest types are a once a week tablet that you swallow. And the issue is side effects. So compliance is low. I think it's predicted that sort of at the sort of 3 year point, nearly 70+% of people are not complying properly, which is a real issue because
Mm.
it's like if we think we're giving you the treatment, but the patient's not using the treatment, then we're not fixing the problem and they're more likely to fracture. So it's really important if you are already on a treatment for osteoporosis and you know you're not using it properly because it's bothering you, tell your prescriber. Because
Yeah.
if you do, girls, we can talk about it and we can figure out a next best option for you. But don't, like, doctors don't want you to be a good patient and just tell us you're taking it when you're not. Or like we don't. We want you to tell the truth because then we can help you. So I get so many patients who say, "Oh, I was really embarrassed to tell you that I stopped taking it last year." And you go, "Well, why did you ask for every month?" And they said, "Oh, because I didn't want to upset you." No, this happens. True story. So you've gotta know that it's okay to tell us, okay, ladies, tell us if it doesn't suit you. So the bisphosphonates are a really big, important group. There are some side effects. I do not want to make a song and dance of them, but ultimately, sometimes the side effects, which can be gastric, and there are some other ones, put people off like using them long term.
Yeah.
But then we're moving on. If we're not using a bisphosphonate, we're tending to use other types of drugs. So there are uh, uh, drugs that can affect our immune system. These are injectable drugs. These again reduce the effect of how our bone cells are breaking down. They calm down the breaking down cells. And there's a drug called denosumab, which is quite a well-used drug now in the UK. There are drugs that affect how you basically use estrogen. They're called selective estrogen receptor modulators. These drugs in women are particularly good at preventing spinal fractures. There are, as we discussed, hormone replacement therapy is an option. But I'm just going to stop on that for a sec because in the UK, there's basically most bone specialist clinics won't offer hormone replacement therapy as a first line treatment option.
So the question
They'll
is why?
say,
Because if we've got all of this, this is the big thing at the moment is people saying, well, it's, it should be first line for menopausal women because we know that it does an improvement in bone strength. So what is holding them back from saying, okay,
okay,
you're a menopausal woman, here's your
so
HRT?
that's a very good question. So the European Osteoporosis Society, despite having a lot of evidence that HRT is safe, and we know that a lot of the studies from years ago have been debunked, and a lot of the risks and concerns around hormone replacement therapy are no longer considered to be valid because we have newer versions of HRT, hormone replacement therapy, that are safe. So they have set a guideline that doesn't recommend it. So then you have that dilemma of all of the clinics that feed into these large guidelines going, well, we can't really go outside of the main guideline. So we're going to let women know maybe that hormone replacement therapy could be helpful, but we're not going to say that we're confident enough that this hormone replacement therapy regime will be enough to build her bone. So what you're tending to find now is bone specialists saying, look, you can have some HRT. Well, I mean, that's just, if I'm really honest, that's if you're really lucky. I would argue that's not been my experience for my patients, but they should be talking about it. But they are still largely recommending the plethora of drugs. And there are many other wide and varied drugs. There's parathyroid type hormone synthetic drugs that affect bones in a good way, that help you actually build bone. They make the cells that build bone work better. So they've got a whole load of drugs. We've got studies to tell us that around 50 micrograms of estradiol seems to be the right level of estrogen to help prevent osteoporosis. We don't actually have, though, enough studies to say it can treat. It should treat because it makes sense that it should treat. We know it's a good preventative. So, for example, to put it into perspective, if you're under 40, and some women sadly go through their menopause prematurely, so a woman who's 35 could go through her menopause. The first line licensed treatment to protect that woman's bones is HRT. So, all the other drugs that we give to all the women in their 50s, we don't really talk to those younger women about because we know that hormone replacement therapy is the right thing for them. So it's quite interesting that then when you get to the other end of the spectrum, you say, okay, I'm now 58 and I've broken my first bone. Well, surely HRT, if it's considered to be safe for me, balancing the risks and benefits and looking at that woman's history, but let's assume it's safe, surely that should be something that's discussed with her straight off the bat, but it's not. And it's a real problem. So what I want women to understand is that HRT certainly can help prevent osteoporosis, especially if you are carrying extra risks. So every woman's going to go through their menopause, right? We said it, 100% of us are going to go through our menopause, but only 50% of us break the bones. So why? What's going on with those women? So those women might have other factors. They might have some of the lifestyle things. They might be super slim. We know that if your parent breaks a hip in their lifetime, that increases your risk of osteoporosis. We know that if you as a woman, we as women, break a bone in our lifetime, there's a 2 to 3 fold likelihood we're going to break another one. So there are genetic factors. If every family member above you is suddenly shorter than you, including the men, well, then you've got some genetic predisposition to osteoporosis. So you've got to start thinking about what is my actual risk? Let me look around myself and think, is this, am I just a woman in her menopause and that's about it? In which case I'm a 50-50, I'm going to take my chances. Or do I have all these other risks? In which case you need to start considering your hormonal choice early. And it's a
Question
choice.
for you. The choice is the important thing, actually, isn't it? And we seem to, you know, poor person the other day who went to the GP and asked for their testosterone to be renewed, and the GP, she saw a different GP, she'd been having it for 3 years, who said, I don't believe in it, which kind of takes the choice away, really, doesn't it? This is
Which
not
is
about
unacceptable. That's like saying I don't believe in evidence-based medicine, so I should
yeah.
just go home. And I have a real issue with prescribers. I'm going to say prescribers because they're not always doctors. Basically, prescribing based on what they think
Yes, and
because
no,
they just think it. You know,
times.
I just think that it's not a good idea, so I'm not going to give it to you. Not here's all the medical evidence and all the clinical trials that say that it's good or bad. And I mean that's where we run into trouble, if I'm honest, with regards to estrogen prescribing, because whilst we must accept as women that the evidence is rubbish sometimes because we have not been studied. Okay. That is sad, but it's fact. But it's dangerous if we start to then go, well, there isn't any evidence, but we all just think it's a good idea. So let's just use loads of estrogen. Let's marinate in estrogen, and we think it's fine. And because we think it's fine, and we think you're feeling better, it's a good idea. Women deserve better than I just think it's okay.
Yeah,
And
and they also deserve
definitely women.
I don't believe in
Absolutely.
it.
Absolutely. And that's not acceptable. And that really hurts my heart for you because it's a story that you hear a lot. I was in I'm digressing. I was in a talk that John Lewis Cambridge held recently for Menopause Awareness Week. And it was a really interesting group of women from across Cambridgeshire, different GP practices, different walks of life. And listening to the stories, it broke my heart because, I've got a woman who's broken a bone. No one discussed fragility fractures. No one talked about a DEXA scan. This woman was 55. She had spina bifida. So she is not weight bearing. She was on a mobility scooter. Like she was a bag of risk factors. I was in the audience and I just couldn't help myself. I went, I just need to have a chat with you. Let me just explain what you need to now go and tell your GP needs to happen next. And no one had brought up HRT with her. It and this is modern medicine. This is 2024. I mean, one of my big passions, as you can hear, is menopause care. Menopause is going to happen to 50% of the population, if not 52%, right? So menopause care should not be specialist. Don't get me wrong, you need
No,
specialists to manage complicated things. But if we can manage blood pressure, we got to be able to manage menopause because
you would.
because it's half your patients. So you got to know about it. There's no excuse not to. And hiding behind the, oh, I don't really know enough about it, so I won't prescribe. It's really sad. So
Well, true. And so if people are listening to this, we are running the Menopause Research and Education Fund is running our next course on the 25th of November for healthcare providers, which will take people from the very basics of understanding the symptoms, just prescribing HRT, testosterone, right through to managing cancer, fibroids,
excellent,
and endometriosis. So people need to sign up for that.
amazing. That's
Um,
amazing.
I have a question here for you from somebody, and this is actually an interesting one. She's saying that she's recently been told that she has osteopenia. She's seeing the GP soon to ask, sort of basically where she is on this scale. Are there any tests that she should ask for, or blood tests, or
Okay,
anything?
that's really helpful. Great question. So this is where we get the NHS versus the non-NHS. So she knows she has osteopenia, so I can assume she's had a bone density scan, which is what we're calling a DEXA scan. It's the same thing. So there are some tests, but they're not available at your GP. So there are quite interestingly, when I say widely used, what I guess I'm getting at is in the private sector, and I imagine in some specialist bone clinic settings, in hospital settings, currently in NHS. And these are looking at two things. You've got bone formation markers. So basically, thinking that through, when you build bone, so when our cells are building bone, there's going to be a byproduct of what happens as the bone's being built. Type 1 collagen is the primary protein in our bone matrix. Remember, the bone's got this amazing matrix in the middle that's chopping and changing all the time. So when you're building bone, a byproduct is basically formed, which is a type of peptide, and you can measure that. And you can measure it. I have to look down at my notes now because I can't even remember the name. It's P1NP, which stands for pro collagen type 1 N terminal propeptide. So you can understand why I can't remember it, but effectively
Yeah.
you can measure it. Okay. And so it makes sense that if you can measure it, that gives you a feeling of how much bone you're making. And so, for example, if you were saying, right, I'm going to go and do loads of weight bearing exercise, I'm going to basically stop all this stuff that I think is bad because Dr. Al-Shaikh said I shouldn't do it and I'm not going to do it. And I want to know, am I building more bone because of it? Well, there kind of is a test that might give you that. And then the flip side is you can test the opposite of that. So as the cells that break down bone and remodel do their job, guess what? There's a byproduct there, and that's a different peptide. And you can measure that. And that's called the CTX or the NTX test. I'm not even going to say what it stands for because I can't tell you without reading it. So effectively, you can measure that. And that's interesting. And that's interesting because if you're giving your bisphosphonate, which is the commonest drug, not for osteopenia, but for osteoporosis, and what that drug does is it's basically affecting the cells that break down bone and it's kind of reducing their activity, then theoretically you can imagine that that CTX test, that byproduct of bone breakdown, would be lower because you're
Yep.
breaking down less bone. So it's thought that these tests can be quite helpful as early markers of giving us more information about what's actually dynamically happening in your bone. But here's the big but. There's no generally agreed assay. So each lab might do it a bit differently. With the bone resorption markers, these are the CTX, NTX things, looking at the byproduct of breaking down bone. That sort of figure, that number, the way we measure it, it's affected depending on what time of day you do the test. So doing it early
Mm.
in the morning is quite important. It's affected by where you are in your hormonal cycle if you're still a woman with a hormonal cycle. So you got to understand that these tests that do exist, they do exist in the private sector. They should exist in metabolic bone clinics, although if I'm really honest, I've never seen it described to me in a letter, and I've been a doctor for 20 years in the NHS. I've never seen it described to me, so I don't know if they're starting to use these yet. I suspect they're not, because they're validated in that we know they make sense, but they're not standardized and accepted. So the problem in the NHS, we're using your money, we're using government money, is we've got to be careful not to spend your money on things that might not be widely accepted as evidence-based. And so that's where the NHS lags a bit. But if you're in other parts of the world, if you're in the United States, and you are fortunate enough to have private medicine, you're probably going to be getting these tests done. So you've got this dilemma. So coming back to our lady, she can't ask her GP for this, but they do exist. So there isn't really, frustratingly for her, something that the GP can do other than suggest a repeat DEXA scan in a couple of years to see if all her good work is paying off. And remember what I said about DEXA scans. Yes, it's radiation, it's double beam radiation. Your bones are absorbing it, but it's very low. It's less than a chest X-ray. So I'm quite relaxed about people accessing DEXA scans. The challenge is accessing one. So if this lady on the NHS goes to her GP, for sure, she would be entitled to a repeat DEXA scan in a couple of years to see where she is. Is she osteoporotic? Is she better? Meaning, is her bone actually really improved? Or is she still in the osteopenic range? That will help guide her journey. Remember, preparing for the fact that you need to be prepared. So she is kind of going to be going on that journey. So that's where we are, though, with regards to other tests that currently exist, as far as I know.
There's somebody's actually asked here as well. You know, she doesn't recall she saw a rheumatologist and that was getting her baselines done for osteoporosis, and does. I'm guessing this was privately and didn't have any of these tests done. So I'm guessing, as you described something else earlier, these are like unicorn poo even in the private sector.
So it's really tricky. So I think the bone turnover markers tests, I think are like, from what I've read and what I understand, I think there is definitely some mileage in them. I think they will be used more. And I can see if I was somebody who was really engaged with my osteoporosis treatment and someone was giving me a really heavy drug that was potentially going to increase my risk of infections and give me other problems, I would kind of want to know that it was working. I wouldn't want to be told, well, in 5 to 10 years, we'll check. Well, I kind of want to know. So I think there's mileage. The unicorn poo, which is like effectively me saying, we just have no, it's like we've made it up, but we don't have enough, we have no information, is some of the unusual things that are being sold. So I was approached on LinkedIn recently by a marketing person from a company that was checking osteoporosis through nail scrapings. And you're like, Jesus, how is that? How? Show me the mechanism. So there's a lot of stuff, urine tests, all sorts of things. Okay. There's a lot of tests being sold, and companies need to make money, and you've got to just be a bit careful because sometimes they quote evidence and studies, but if you just do one simple drill into that, it's often the company that made the test doing the study.
Which it was
So
in
I
this
get
case.
I get that that's important. They gotta like figure it out, but you gotta like take that with a pinch of salt. So
Yeah. The
there
other,
isn't anything validated other than what we're talking about.
which is the other one actually, there's a big push I know at the moment for to sell ultrasound machines to clinics so that they can do ultrasounds on women to give them not just a risk fracture. It was because you mentioned before that bones, we have we've got the solid bit on the outside, and on the inside we've got that cross matrix. And I
Yes.
think what they were trying to say was that the ultrasound would look at that matrix and then modify your fracture risk, because it would, if your
How?
matrix was good, if you think I think the logic was, if your matrix was good, then your fracture risk was actually less. And
Okay,
so
so
there's
okay, so
validation in that.
there's okay, that's interesting. So the answer is I don't know the validation of the ultrasound, but I'll tell you where the theory comes. So here's a complicated bit about bone mineral density. So you could go and have a DEXA, and it will tell you that your bone mineral density is low. Okay. So it's not osteoporosis, but it is lower than we want it to be. And when we work it out, by the way, we're comparing your bones to somebody of your sex who's younger. And we're just going, well, compared to someone younger than you, who's also a woman or a person with an ovarian system, we think that it's a bit lower than we'd want it to be. So that's how they do it. So that only tells you about the kind of strength is the best, easiest, most simplistic way of explaining it. But like you just said, it doesn't really tell you about what's going on inside, the remodeling that's happening. Because, like we've been thinking about, there's lots of other things that affect the remodeling. And so you can have low bone mineral density and not necessarily be at a much higher risk of fracture despite the low bone mineral density, because there are other things that affect whether or not the structure is going to break, like all the lifestyle stuff, whether you're very low weight, whether you're on other prescribed medications. So there are drugs that we give patients because we have to. So people with epilepsy are more at risk of osteoporosis because of the drugs we give them. And it's difficult because they need to not have a fit, which is a seizure, but the drugs can thin their bones. So we got to kind of be working with those patients really closely to say, look, let's start getting you active and doing things now to prevent bone loss. Let's really think about your hormonal choice early, because it's a choice. So what I would say is the scan from what you described is going to give you something, but what it's basically going to do for probably vast amounts of money is tell you basically what we're saying, which is you just gotta think about your bone health. And I suspect there's nothing about that ultrasound that's going to kind of say anything different, which is, put it this way: if someone had a scan and they said, don't worry, your bones look great, and that patient was a skinny, smoking alcoholic, I say, well, hang on now, that scan, despite it saying she looks all right, isn't a reason for her to not change her behaviors and her lifestyle. So I
Yeah,
just
that's what
take these
worries
things with
me
a
about
pinch of
this. I've
salt.
been sending
That's what
with
would worry me. The best thing women could spend their money on is a bloody skipping rope. Now, don't get me wrong, we've got pelvic floor issues and leaky ladies and all those things, but most of us could do like 20 jumps a day, little ones. Like, there's
I do
evidence
them
that
now when
doing
they're
that helps.
kettle on. I just stand up and jump
You
and
can stand up and jump.
yeah.
I am super hyperactive. I jump up and down in my desk all the time because even on the phone to patients, I've got my headset on and I'm just doing a couple of jumps because I need to keep moving. I'm a bit ADHD. I've got to keep active. And so just you can spend your money on really simple things that I think would be better for you than sometimes some of these tests that are not really going to tell you anything that, to be honest, you don't already know.
Yeah, yeah. I had another question coming. This is the other thing. I'm going back to HRT and what we do and we don't know. But before I do that, speaking of being ADHD and jumping from one thing to another, not that that probably is necessarily an ADHD thing. It's just the way my brain works. Is you mentioned low weight there, and it's not just there are ethnic differences in this as well, aren't there? Because especially with Asian women who are just sort of naturally quite small, they may not
Yeah.
realise that their risk might be higher.
And Asian women tend to have much lower vitamin D levels. So we haven't really touched on that. So vitamin D is very important. Now, if the World Health Organization had it their way, we'd all take vitamin D every day. It's really tricky with regards to levels. I think it would be helpful for you to know your vitamin D level so you can then gauge whether you need a supplement. You know, basically women with normal levels tend to be the women who go outside. So they are either doing some activities outside, working outdoors, having a reason to be outside, walking a pet, an adult, a child. Like there's some reason for them to be out and about. And I think there's a misnomer in the UK, because don't get me wrong, yeah, I know it's kind of grey, but like there are bright days, even in winter, and you just got to get outdoors. It's really important. That's where you get your vitamin D. Most of it comes from the bright light that comes through our clouds, comes from the sun. So vitamin D deficiency is a real problem. So in Asian women specifically as well, they tend to be low in vitamin D. And then you've got cultural differences in intake of food and calcium levels. The Royal Osteoporosis Society has a really decent website. I actually think it's probably the best generalized information around osteoporosis, and it really goes into exercise in quite a good way. I really like it, and it has a link to a scoring little chart that you can just put in some really basic data. It's easy to use to give you a feeling of what your calcium intake is like on a weekly basis, and that's helpful. And with regards to vitamin D, it's tricky because ultimately you just got to get your level checked. And the NHS can do that. So, the GP practices couldn't cope with every woman on the planet going and asking for a vitamin D test tomorrow. But generally, you may have already had it checked, you just didn't know. So sometimes scouring the NHS app and seeing what bloods you've had are helpful. But knowing where you are is important, because you might think that you are really low and you're not. You might be taking massive supplements that you don't need. Because calcium and vitamin D work together, they work in harmony. And so the problem is, if you take too much of one, you can disrupt the other. And there can be a problem sometimes, especially with calcium, because we're in a supplement nation. Every
Mm.
woman I meet is taking 5 different supplements. And the reality is, I just want you to eat it. And I know life is busy, don't get me wrong, but I'd rather you eat the whole food. But sometimes you can't quite make it. You can't quite make the level you want to get to. That's where the supplements come in. But we're taking things where the supplements overlap and you can overdose. And that's not good. So too much calcium, there's some anecdotal discussion around, is it bad for your heart? It could be. It could cause other issues. So don't want to overdo it. So again, please don't go and buy loads of supplements that you don't need. I would much rather step one is think about what you're eating. And again, I came back to the ethnic kind of differences, because there's differences in what we eat, whether we're strict vegans, vegetarians, how we supplement our diets. And so again, you're right, osteoporosis, it's something that's sometimes just accepted culturally. The women in my family just get short. Granny's just a little old lady. Little old ladies are
Mm. Good point.
osteoporotic. They're not normal.
But don't tell
They're
your
normal.
grandmother.
They're
Don't tell
normal. But we've accepted the little old lady as being normal within our society. We've accepted a disease happening to women that we don't treat. We've accepted
Yeah,
it because little old ladies are in the children's books that I used to read to my children. So I'm teaching them that little old ladies, they're common, because we don't treat osteoporosis as women. So it's a problem.
yeah. But we get into a spin, don't we? Now, speaking of calcium and vitamin D, so basically, if people are looking at taking, there's an argument that that you shouldn't have a calcium supplement with your vitamin D. Where do we think that stands? Because you mentioned the heart risk there.
Okay, so you can have both together. The question is, do you need it? So this is going to be a very simplistic generalization. Right now, in October, in the UK, you're more likely to have a peri or postmenopausal woman low in vitamin D, because she's working indoors all day, she's not getting outside. By the time she leaves, the clocks have changed, it's dark. She's more likely low in vitamin D than low in calcium, but you can track calcium really easily. There's all these free things online where you can just get a feeling. Am I eating enough? Because again, calcium, people just assume it's coming from milk, but it's not. It's coming from all different foods. So you effectively might be getting enough calcium just through your nuts and vegetables or whatever it is you're eating. So I would encourage everyone to do a quick calcium tracker, and the Royal Osteoporosis Society has a little quick link to a scoring tool, which is really helpful. It's quick and easy, just gives you a rough idea. Vitamin D though is tricky, because effectively we probably are all a bit deficient. So if you had to generalize, or are we likely going to be deficient in calcium and vitamin D? It's probably vitamin D. And so then you've got the dilemma: do I just go and take it? And the recommended amount is, it's in units. somewhere between 800 units to 1,000 units a day. This stuff is cheap. It's like less than £1 to buy. You can get a blood test. You can ask your practices to check your vitamin D level so you understand where you are. So if you do take it, you can then work out whether or not what you're doing is working. If you're very deficient, so if your vitamin D level is what we would call deficiency, the NHS gets excited and we start really replacing it at high doses. And that becomes really important in the elderly. I'm going to try not to offend anyone now. And the elderly, I'm really thinking about 80 plus, okay? Where if they're really low in vitamin D, that's a problem because that has an effect on their calcium and vitamin D kind of balance. That has effect on their bone matrix. Remember, they're already a bit older, everything's slowing down, then they're a woman, they've got no estrogen, so their osteoporosis risk is jumping. So we want to do anything we can to kind of put everything in balance.
Yeah. Now, that leads me to the older woman that I was going to before. Women in their 70s, 80s, as you mentioned there, who've got, a lot of sort of comorbidities, perhaps, but, may well have their heart health really in relatively good control. If they've got osteoporosis, can they start on HRT in their 70s or early 80s?
So where we are with hormone replacement therapy and what we're really talking about is estrogen replacement is the science currently says that if you are 10 years from your last menstrual period, and for some women they don't really know, but most women do, but if you're 10 years or over where you have had no hormone replacement therapy, therefore your body has adapted to the low estrogen state or the no estrogen state, as it stands, it's considered to be quite dangerous to introduce estrogen when you've gone a decade or more with none. And that's due to the stroke risk that's associated. We think that we adapt, and therefore, all of the tissues, all of the body's mechanisms, everything just gets really used to that desert state of no estrogen. So, if you then go and throw it back at a woman, there's a risk that that can cause harm. Now, it gets a little bit more nuanced because then you're starting to go, okay, well, the 65-year-old woman who's kind of just 10 years from her last period that was at 55, she's a different person and a different ball game for me as a specialist in menopause than my 75-year-old woman who really is well into her menopause. So there are conversations that can be had if you're just at that 10-year point. And realistically, what we're really worrying about is that woman's cardiovascular risk factors and function. And in an ideal world, magic one moment, I wouldn't just be doing her cholesterol levels and her blood pressure and understanding her medical history. I'd probably be doing a cardiac CT scoring scan, which I can't just go and ask for in the NHS without a really good reason. And at the moment, this would not be considered in the NHS a really good reason because we're thinking about HRT in older women. So there are things that we can do to really understand that woman's risk and work out whether giving estrogen is safe or not. But to be honest, there is a window of opportunity with HRT, and that window is about a decade from your last natural period. And that doesn't mean the science is not going to change, but that's where the science is. So we tend to be a bit more nervous, cautious, and probably just don't prescribe hormone replacement therapy when you're well over that decade. Now, that woman, though, could do other things. So there is a whole plethora of bone resorbing drugs, meaning drugs that stop the bone cells breaking down bone. Then there are the drugs that encourage the bone cells that build bone to build bone better. So we do have a lovely toolbox full of tools that we can talk to that woman about. But that 75-year-old plus, we're probably not going to be talking about hormones. It's too late. And I
Interesting one,
really
actually.
believe in a positive way because of all the good that's being done at the moment.
The
I mean, I do believe that, I mean, I hope that those women become less and less.
Well, yeah, because you'd hope that this generation now has much more information, and then hopefully we will be stronger by the time we're 75, in theory. I guess the other side of that too, though, is if you do then decide, do you think, okay, well, look, the heart side of everything is under control, and she's looking at it, she's in pretty good health. She is also a much older woman. Is there a higher risk of, we know what the risk and benefits are for cancer between women aged 50 to 59. How do we know what they are?
Okay.
Could you be putting Granny at risk of developing an endometrial or breast cancer?
Okay. So the breast is important. So HRT does not take a breast cell and turn it into cancer. It's not what it does. What it does is it accelerates the process of breast cancer in a woman who's predisposed. Every decade we get older, our cancer risk goes up just because we're older. So, would you see more breast cancer if you started HRT in women in their 80s? Well, you could guess probably, because they are carrying a higher risk just because they're 80, and we're
Yeah.
giving them a drug which effectively is going to speed up that cancerous process. That's the kind of rationale. Endometrial cancer, if a woman's got a womb, you're always going to give combined HRT. That protects the womb against the bad effects of estrogen. Estrogen reigns on the womb. It makes the cells twist and turn and change. Anything that changes too much gets abnormal. Abnormal can become cancer. So that's why a woman with one, or a person with one, basically has to have combined HRT. So I'm less worried about endometrial cancer risk, if I'm honest. The issue is that estrogen can increase clots and venous thromboembolism and events such as strokes, and that risk goes up with age as well. And
Even
the other,
normal,
even if we're healthy, because we're just getting older, and you just got
or
to remember
even
that you're
normal, even with the patches or the gel, because normally the clot
okay.
just.
So the patches and so any estrogen through the skin is considered to have a negligible increased risk in clotting. Swallowing estrogen is pretty safe. I'm a big fan of oral estrogen, and there are some women where we go, "Oh, your risks are a bit too high. Let's put it through the skin." But there are many women who put it through skin who could just bloody swallow it. They don't need to be putting it through the skin. And for me, compliance is key. Pick what you're going to do and use, or there's no point using it, right? Otherwise, it doesn't work. So, yeah, you could say, if you've got the older woman, would you consider putting it through the skin? Again, if she's over a decade, though, from her last natural period, you're in risky territory because you're in non-evidence-based medicine territory. So as it stands, would I do it? No. Would I have a conversation with women so she really understands the rationale behind it, the risks, the benefits? Yes. Would I still give an 80-year-old the choice to start estrogen after 20 years of being in her menopause? No, I wouldn't offer it as a choice, because I would be doing harm. Because the current evidence suggests that I would be doing harm, and I must do no harm. My first rules as a doctor, right? So as it stands, the science isn't there. That doesn't mean it won't get there. But we have a different conversation with those women. And those women are likely going to be having more conversations about the other drugs that are on offer. And it's never too late to build bone, build balance, build resistance. But it's harder to do if you've never done it.
Yeah, yeah.
So, the quick step, most people break their bone tripping over their flipping handbags. You've got to you've got to be able to quickly stop yourself from falling on your face. And that requires some practice.
That's very true. Now, speaking of breaking bones, you mentioned before type 1 collagen. Now, the other thing that's very popular these days, of course, is collagen supplements. Is there any evidence that collagen supplements can help with bone strength? Are you
Good question. So there are some studies.
Yeah.
Okay. I had a delay, but I heard what you said. Okay. So we've got small studies, small numbers saying that 5 to 10 grams of collagen, hydrolyzed collagen, could help bone. It could help bone building. It could prevent bone resorption. Remember, type 1 collagen's the main, about 80+% of our bone matrix is collagen. So it's tricky because there's some anecdotal small number data. It makes sense that theoretically, if collagen's a big part of our bone matrix, then having it's a good idea. We don't really know. We don't know enough. If it's powdered, if it's liquid, if we really need it, if you swallow it, if it gets digested, does it eventually get into the bone? That we don't know. I
But I
think
guess if
personally,
you're
I
eating
can't
enough
believe
protein,
it's harmful.
yeah,
Yes.
if you're getting
So
enough protein.
where we are on collagen is, I don't think it's harmful. I don't think you can do harm to yourself by swallowing it, but I don't have enough data to say it's definitely going to fix things.
But protein in the diet, just making sure you're eating enough protein.
Protein in diet, I mean, most people in the Western world are not protein deficient, but it's worth tracking your macros, which is protein, your fiber, your fat. It's really worth it. There's so many free apps, because often you just don't realize what you're eating and what you're not eating. And we want to be aiming to think about protein. And if you're really weight bearing in training, you might be aiming to build muscles. You might be aiming to go for like about 1 gram to 2 grams per ideal kilo of body weight. So that's basically, for some women, stretching over 100 grams of protein a day, which is doable. just by eating some chicken, some nuts, and a lot of vegetables, and maybe some lentils. So you don't have to take protein supplements and protein drinks. You've got to be careful with protein, because if you're not doing enough exercise, you'll gain weight. And remember, I don't really care if you gain weight, get strong, don't get skinny. But if you're not trying to get strong, you're not probably helping yourself in general. So you just gotta, don't go wild buying protein supplements and drinking it because it looks cool in my nice new cup that everyone's walking around with, those bloody massive cups. But effectively, kind of know what you're doing before you think about it. And then you need to think about, am I getting it? And if I follow a strict diet, where am I getting my protein from? So you don't have to eat meat to eat protein, but you need to be consciously aware of what food groups, what food types have some protein in it. So you introduce it. So yes, protein is really important. And I do think midlife women need to be thinking about it a lot. And again, I suspect we're not, because we're busy. And it's just like sometimes, just planning. But it is tough. You can't be perfect every day. You just got to just, make an effort when you can.
Absolutely. So we are up to our hour, basically. So what's your take-home message? Have we covered everything off? I think we covered everything we had on the list, didn't we? I think we have. What's your take-home message?
We can help you, as medical professionals can help you understand what's going on in your bones. Get strong. Don't get skinny, girls. I want you all getting strong, and I want everyone to stop obsessing about being thinner, because it's not important anymore. I want you to be strong in midlife. I want you to be able to get your suitcase and put it in the overhead locker when you're 85 if you want to do that and go on holiday. I need you to be able to do that. I think the headline is, bones are metabolic and not just structural. They do a lot of good. So respect them, nurture them, look after them, care for them, care about them. You need to know why you need to care about them, because they're going to serve you well with multiple bodily functions. And I think for me, it's just that kind of, what have I done this week to think about my bones? Well, have I eaten something? Have I not done something? Have I discussed it? Have I jumped up and down? Have I bought my weighted vest and worn it round the parking lot on the way into my office? What have I done this week to help my bones? That would be the thing. They're starting to have the chat, talk to your friends about it, discuss it, just talk about it. It's really, and then start getting ideas. And for me, that's the important bit.
Absolutely.
A lot of
And
headlines there, not one message.
that's all right.
Sorry.
And where do people find you if they want to find you again, my love? And if people want to know about you, just for the ones who have sort of joined a bit late here, if you want to know why bones are so important, you're going to have to go right back to the beginning of this talk and listen to it over, because it's just so much more than carrying you around and protecting your internal organs. Where do people find you?
100%. So I'm Dr. Reem Al-Shaikh. I'm a co-founder with Dr. Gillian Shields at womenswellnessclinic.co.uk, and you can come and see us face to face or online. We also exist in the NHS. Our NHS patients know us well. So on the NHS, unless you're registered with us, you can't come and meet us. But in the private sector, Women's Wellness Clinic, come say hi.
Brilliant. All right. Got a lot of thank yous here on the Instagram. So I will end that there on the Instagram, and I will end this over here on that. And thank you very much for joining us. And hopefully we will do this again soon.